Hi, my name's Lizzie Banwell. I'm one of the clinical psychologists based in the Psychological Health Service at the Haematology and Oncology Centre based in Bristol, and I'm part of the Bristol and Western team. So I'm talking today about dealing with the psychological impact after treatment. So just to say before we go into the content of the session today, really do remember to take care of yourselves as you're listening to the session today. So we'll be talking about some difficult thoughts and feelings that might have shown up for you. So please rest assured these are completely normal for you to be experiencing, and we'll be talking through some strategies that might help you manage and ways that you might be able to respond when these things show up. If you do need to pause whilst you're watching, that's fine. Take a break if you need to. So remember to look after yourself at this time. And we're talking through some additional information and support that you might find beneficial at the end of the session today. So in terms of the aims of the session, we're going to be covering three main areas. So thinking about what's normal adjustment, the process of adjustment, and the process of recovery. But just to say, we are all individuals, so you will all experience different thoughts and feelings that might have been showing up throughout your experience of diagnosis and treatment. So I'll be talking generally about what the range of experiences might be that people have experienced following their diagnosis and treatment journeys, but what you're experiencing is of course individual to you, so there will be differences between people. So thinking, why is there a psychology session as part of this next steps talk? So we know that it can be really common for people to experience the emotional impact following their diagnosis and treatment journeys. So 45% of people with cancer say that the emotional aspects of that experience have been the most difficult to cope with compared to the practical and physical effects. So what we know is it can be really normal to experience emotional difficulties following diagnosis and treatment. And this word cloud here shows a range of feelings that people have shared experiencing. So these were completed by patients who'd attended one of the Western Health and Wellbeing events a few months ago. And the words that come up largest are the ones that people reported experiencing most commonly. So you'll see sadness, shock, fear, nervousness were really common responses, but also other feelings such as triumph and relief as well. And just to say, experiencing a range of emotions is completely understandable and a very normal reaction. And also, just to note, the experience of holding conflicting feelings can also feel quite overwhelming or tiring at times. So sometimes that experience of holding those feelings can impact your emotional experience overall as well. So thinking a little bit about some of the psychological models that underpin these emotional experiences then, we're going to talk a little bit about mental models. And so we hold mental models about ourselves, others, and the world around us. And so these mental models are what we call pre-conscious. So they're automatic. You often don't realise that you have them. But they're ways of making sense about the world around us and can help us form these cognitive thinking shortcuts, really, so we can predict and get a sense of control around the world around us. And they're things that we build up throughout our lives, so based on our experiences. So when we're young, it's often our primary caregivers that experience and that provide us those experiences from which we build those mental models, such as they teach us to look both ways before crossing the road and teach us not to touch the top of the cooker when it's on, else we'll burn ourselves. So these are things that we then accumulate into our automatic ways of responding and making sense of the world around us. So one example here is I'd like you just to see when you see this image flash up here, what does this picture represent to you? What does it show? Very commonly what people say is that it's a smiley face or an emoji. And this is a pretty universal representation here of a face. And this is an example of a commonly held mental model. So if we boil this down, all this really is a yellow circle with two black dots and a curly line on it. But this is an example of a mental model of a way that we've learned to identify this facial representation, that we do it without thinking, that we automatically can recognise this symbol as a face. And that's one example of a shared mental model. But thinking about how we deal with new experiences. So every new experience leads to either new information being merged into an existing mental model, or existing mental models are then modified in order to incorporate that new information. So what we find is small, unexpected changes in our lives might mean that we make a small modification to our mental model. Or it might be that we can make an exception even for that piece of information and just discount it rather than change our mental model as a result. However, for larger changes that we might experience in our lives, such as a diagnosis of cancer and going through the associated treatment, it might mean there's a more protracted period of adaptation and adjustment, and also people are having to adjust and adapt a number of different mental models at one time and not just one in isolation. So I'm going to talk you through an adjustment model here, and this was developed by a psychologist called James Brennan. And what this shows us is how we can have expectations regarding our experiences, and that leads either our mental models to be confirmed or disconfirmed. So I'm going to talk through common mental models around physical illness, and I'm going to use the example to start with of the common cold. So my mental model of having a cold is, I have built up this expectation based on my experiences throughout my life of having a cold. So my expectation followed by my experience means that my expectation is then confirmed. So my expectation might be around the severity, the range of symptoms and the duration of the symptoms that I experience. So it might be that I notice a few symptoms start over a couple of days, they gradually get worse. I might take some over-the-counter medications such as paracetamol or Lemsip. Might have to take it easy for a few days, but it might not have a huge impact on my daily functioning. I might expect it to last for 5 to 7 days, and then I could be back doing my normal activities again. And each time I've had a cold throughout my life, it's confirmed my expectation through my experience being largely in line with what I've expected from my previous experience. So that strengthens my mental model of health and physical illness. So I present with some symptoms, I take some treatment that makes me feel better, and I've got some idea of how long I can expect it to last, and I can return to my normal functioning afterwards. What we find is that people's experiences of being diagnosed with cancer and going through the associated treatments is that these experiences can really be turned on their head. So people might find their experience of their mental model of what it means to be physically unwell, their expectation is disconfirmed that, and this isn't the case for everybody, of course, but we might find that some people perhaps were diagnosed at the point that they weren't experiencing any symptoms at all, and perhaps they actually felt quite physically well at the time of diagnosis. And actually it was the treatment itself that made them feel quite unwell. So perhaps the side effects of chemotherapy or radiotherapy, we often find that those things, actually the side effects tend to get worse throughout treatment, and perhaps at the point of, say, when somebody completes radiotherapy, they're actually feeling the most in terms of their physical side effects at that point. Whereas people around them and perhaps their previous expectations have been that at that point they'd be feeling a lot better by then. And often people might say to us, I know when I've worked with people one-to-one, they say actually sometimes that can be quite challenging because very well-intended friends and relatives say, in terms of their expectation, they finish treatment, they'll be feeling better, that they say, great, that's finished treatment, you'll be back to doing the things that you want to do, you must be feeling so much better by now. Whereas actually the individual's experience at that time point is they're having all sorts of side effects and it's still really having an impact on their life. And so that can be a really challenging experience and cause them to experience stress, which we'll be coming on to in just a moment. But I just wanted to flag one part of this model here is this experience of what we call denial. But denial in this sense is quite an adaptive psychological response. So what we mean by denial here is a temporary withdrawal and stepping back from that psychological process of meaning making and adjustment. So where we might see this, for instance, is if somebody's going through radiotherapy, for instance, it's quite an involved treatment. They're coming up to the oncology centre perhaps 5 days of every week. It might be quite time consuming. They might be at the oncology centre for a few hours at a time. And if they're having to travel from outside of the Bristol area, perhaps they're quite tired by the time they get home because it's taken quite a lot to just physically get to and from the treatment centre each day. So actually, it might be quite adaptive to just pause the psychological meaning-making and adjustment until they've completed their course of radiotherapy, when they've got a bit more and physical time and space, and therefore psychological space, to actually process what that means to have gone through what they have done. I guess where we might start to think about denial as more of an issue is if that denial is impacting on somebody's daily functioning, perhaps, or their engagement with their treatment, engagement with the team, or just engagement in things and daily life more widely. And just to say about stress, as I mentioned before, so what we do know is that people will experience stress as a result of this experience of changing our mental models and having them challenged in some way. And of course, stress will look and feel different for everybody. And I'll be talking about that on the next slide. But it's that process of stress that leads to this adjustment in terms of adapting to the new life that people are living alongside. And I'll be talking through some strategies that might help you with that in the next few slides. So as I mentioned, people will experience stress in different ways. And so it can look and feel very differently for different people. And there can be lots of challenges to people's expectations, where they thought they might be at a given time. And like I was saying before, you have to change perhaps a number of mental models at one time. So that experience of stress can be very real and have a real impact for people. And it can show itself in a range of ways. So it might be emotionally, people feel short-tempered or irritable. It might be mentally, that they feel a bit more forgetful or have difficulty concentrating on things. Or perhaps physically, they feel more fatigued. And of course, some of these things can be impacted by people's treatment as well. We know fatigue, of course, can be an impact of the treatment that people have gone through. So these feelings of stress might just be an additional layer, perhaps, in terms of those side effects that people may have experienced following their treatment. So perhaps just take some time to think about what stress looks like for you and how that might vary on different days and depending on the things that you're encountering. So just to say at this point, it's the context that is abnormal here and not you. So the experience of diagnosis and treatment can be a period of sustained threat, lots of change, lots of uncertainty, long, tough medical treatments. Of course, everybody's experience is different, but I'm speaking generally here, but we do recognise that there's a huge range of challenges that people are encountering and negotiating. And there can also be lots of change and loss in terms of roles, perhaps your identity, body image, so perhaps physical scarring or change of function in some way, fertility, and that can link to hopes for the future and our expectations that we had for our lives. So it can really feed into all layers really of our experience of what it means to be human and where we fit with the world and connect with the things that matter to us. So again, I'm speaking generally here, but the common mental models that we find can be affected by people with cancer is thoughts around the future, so that imagined future, so where you thought you'd be, things that you might be doing, relationships, both with yourself and other people, and views about the world and yourself within it. And again, they're different for everybody, but just talking generally, these are the ones that we commonly find can show up for people. So I'm just going to talk through some strategies, some ways that might help you respond to some of those difficult thoughts and feelings that may show up for you. So I'm going to use a framework to talk through this. It's called the worry tree, and you can find out more information about that in the information and resources that I'll signpost you to at the end of the talk today. So it can be good just to learn to step back, really. So when you notice difficult thoughts or worries show up for you, just taking that step back and asking yourself, okay, what is it that I'm worrying about here? And perhaps writing it down. And then asking yourself, is there something that I can do about this? Is this within or outside of my control? And dependent on the answer to that question, we can then even think about perhaps an action plan. If it's something that's within your control, there might be some things that you can do in terms of breaking it down, thinking about different practical things that you might be able to do, versus the things outside of your control. And that's then more a sense of letting that worry go. And I'll be talking through some techniques of doing that, because we appreciate that can be a really challenging thing to do. But I think by identifying which area you're focusing on can be a helpful step as to where to go next. So the initial strategies we're going to be focusing on are those which fall into the more practical action plan. So just using those mental models that I mentioned before as a framework for this. So look into the future. What helps? So thinking about maintaining, restoring or enhancing motivational structure in your life, but in a manageable step-by-step way. So thinking about developing plans for the future as you feel comfortable, and just being aware that we often as humans want to be a bit further down the line than where we already are, and can often feel quite critical with ourselves for not being as far ahead as we'd hope to be. And our mental models, those expectations, feed into that. So recording steps along the way, so noticing those achievements that can help to boost your motivation and belief and confidence in your ability to achieve things, and just have that positive feedback. And really remembering to be kind and patient with yourself. I think as humans, we're really good at being negative and self-critical and pushing ourselves perhaps harder than we would expect close friends or relatives to do. So sometimes taking that step back and think, what would I recommend to a friend or relative if they were in my situation? Because we often find it easier to be more kind and compassionate to other people than we are to ourselves. So thinking about how you might achieve those things. So adjusting or creating roles that provide opportunities for positive feedback. And perhaps if you notice that you feel a bit wobbly about something that you didn't used to, perhaps just dialing back a bit. So building back slowly in small steps, and not expecting yourself to be immediately at the stage that you were prior to diagnosis, perhaps. So having those realistic, self-compassionate expectations of yourself in your recovery. And acknowledging the results given the circumstances. So noticing where you've come from and the progress that you've made so far, and not just focusing on where you want to get to. Of course, that's important to focus on the future and where you'd like to head to, but congratulating yourself for the steps and the progress that you've made so far is important as well. So above all, look after yourself. So then thinking about relationships and what helps in that regard. So spending time kind of reflecting on what you want from other people and what you're prepared to give, and how that might have changed from prior to your diagnosis. Finding ways to ask for certain things. Often people can find it quite challenging to ask for support, particularly if they've been in a role of providing support to others. It can feel like a real shift to be in a different role. So perhaps practicing how you might say those things, and trying out perhaps with somebody that you feel safer to ask those things to in the initial. And then having these stock phrases. So there might be certain questions that you can anticipate people might ask. And again, it's very well-intended questions, perhaps by friends or relatives, but perhaps having some examples that you've practiced beforehand, so it doesn't kind of put you on the back foot, that you feel a bit surprised by a certain question you might be asked. That it's up to you what you share and with whom, of course, and there may well be different things that you feel comfortable sharing with different people, and that's, of course, your decision. But taking some time to think about what that might look like, how you might phrase things, can help you feel a bit more confident going back into perhaps social situations that you might not have been in for a while. And having some contact, and that can be in a variety of ways, but with people who get it. So like I mentioned before, in terms of sometimes those well-intended comments by people around you might feel perhaps hurtful, or like people don't understand when people say, perhaps at the end of your treatment, "That's great, you must be feeling so much better." It can feel exhausting, kind of sharing and explaining where you're at. It can feel like you're doing that quite a lot, and that can feel draining and add to the perhaps fatigue that you're already experiencing. So having some contact with the people who get that, where you don't need to explain all of those things to, can be quite empowering as well. And just knowing there's other people going through something similar to you as well. And finding space to prioritise the relationships that nurture rather than drain you. So thinking about what you need and feeling more comfortable to ask for it, to seek that out. And now we're going to be moving on to that other side of the worry tree now. So thinking about the things when you ask yourself, is this situation about the thing that I'm worrying about here, thinking about, is this something that I have an element of control over? Is it happening in the here and now, and do I have control over it? If no, there's some different strategies that we can use just to help us let that worry go. And I appreciate that can be a really hard thing to do. So it's 3 words there, but I appreciate it's really not easy. But I think the more that we practice these strategies and ways of coping, then the more confident you can be to draw on those as and when you need to. So very often as humans, we can be very good about thinking about things in the future, that we tend to focus on perhaps the things that are out of our control, or they might be far in the future, or they might be just a thought, a guess, an assumption, rather than based in certainty and fact. And all of those things are really understandable. As humans, our brains are often wired that when faced with uncertainty, we tend to feel quite anxious and quite worried. And that's because we like to have a sense of control and predictability about our future and the world around us. And that makes complete sense. But how we experience, the impact of worry can be that it can feel quite unpleasant in the moment and quite overwhelming. And then it can also take us away from being present in the moment and engaging with the people and engaging in the things that matter to us. So that's what I'm going to think about here in terms of some of those strategies that might help in that regard. So just thinking for a moment, has anybody told you, don't worry about it, just think positive? Does happiness depend on people being able to just push negative thoughts out of their mind? So I'm going to think about that for a moment now. So I'd like you just to do this quick thought experiment here. So as you're looking at this slide, I would like you to not think about this pink elephant. And I'm going to time you for 10 seconds more. Whatever you do, don't think about the pink elephant. Okay, time's up. And just thinking to yourself, how many of you thought about the pink elephant? Really commonly, people find that that's exactly what they think about. And the more they try not to think about something, the more they think about it. And then the more frustrating that can feel, and so on and so forth. So this vicious cycle can ensue. So this thought suppression, trying not to think about something, it's a paradoxical phenomenon. Because very often, lots of research has shown that the more we try not to think about something, the more we tend to think about it, and the more it tends to make us feel perhaps anxious, low in mood, self-critical, and that then feeds those negative thoughts and feelings and so on. Some people find, when I go back to that previous slide, when I show the pink elephant and say, try not to think about it, some people find that they do manage to not think about it because they might distract themselves, perhaps looking away from the screen or busying themselves with something else that's very distracting. And short-term distraction can absolutely be a helpful strategy for some. So some people might say that perhaps they have a clinic appointment that they're feeling apprehensive about. It might be a Friday, say they've got the clinic appointment on a Monday, and they've got a pretty busy weekend ahead. Actually, they're pretty busy seeing friends and family, getting out and about, doing things that they enjoy. So actually they manage quite well not to think about it because they're pretty distracted. And that's okay. That can be a helpful coping mechanism for some. But I would urge a word of caution with using that is that it doesn't tend to be a helpful long-term strategy. So for something very short-term, just a few kind of minutes at a time, perhaps, for those of you who perhaps looked away from the screen or busied yourself, if I asked you to not think about this pink elephant for the rest of the day, you'd probably find that it did pop in there at some point. So it can be helpful to have a range of other coping strategies to draw on rather than distraction alone, because actually we find as time goes on in terms of longer term coping, distraction doesn't really serve us terribly well. So is there an alternative way? So we know that kind of struggling with worry, trying not to think about it, we tend to think about it more, and that can feel really frustrating as well. So that experience of struggling with trying to get rid of something actually doesn't serve us terribly well. So is there an alternative way of responding? Can we live alongside those difficult thoughts and feelings, knowing that unfortunately we can't get rid of them, but there's things that we can do that help us engage with the things that matter to us and be more present in the moment, that as a happy byproduct mean that we're feeling less caught up in those negative thoughts and feelings. So one of the ways of doing that is seeing thoughts for exactly what they are. So they're mental events that we can have hundreds of thoughts that pop into our minds throughout the day. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative, and some of those are more neutral. And it tends to be that those negative thoughts are the ones that we tend to focus on a bit more, and the ones that tend to hang around or might pop back more regularly. So if we can notice our thought-feeling responses, that I notice when that thought shows up, it makes me feel a certain way, anxious, sad, low, whatever that might be. And we've all got our own different ways of conceptualizing feelings that might show up for us. So, but by being able to step back and to notice those thoughts, and almost like seeing them as words projected onto a screen in front of you, it can help you take that step back and think about an alternative way of responding to them. But first and foremost, thoughts are entirely normal, and particularly tricky thoughts and feelings in response to what you're experiencing, as we've talked about today. It's completely normal to have those experiences, but it's then how we respond that determines the impact it might have on your life and the things that you engage with. So mindfulness can be a really popular way of stepping back from thoughts and grounding yourself in the moment. And there's an awful lot of resources out there which can be very helpful for people. So I'd certainly recommend checking those out. So what we mean by mindfulness is that when we worry about things that are coming up in the future, or we think about things that have happened in the past, it means that we're very much in our heads rather than being in the moment. So mindfulness is about having a non-judgmental present moment awareness. So being in the here and now, noticing what's happening in this moment and without judgment. So ways of grounding yourself in the moment might be engaging in your senses. So what can you see around you? What can you hear? What can you taste? What can you touch, perhaps with your hands, or feel your feet on the floor beneath you, or being supported by the chair beneath you? Focusing on the breath, or perhaps things, you might hold an object that you can feel as well, and smell as well. So really engaging those senses, grounding yourself in the things around you. And then thinking about what matters, so our values. So sometimes just doing something we really enjoy, something that's really important to us, can really help to absorb our attention. So thinking about what's your sponge, when do you feel most like you? And by identifying those things, the people and the things that really matter to you, it can help give you a steer as to where might be a useful area for you to spend your time, what might be a helpful focus for you. And there may well be some adaptations that you need to make in line with perhaps changes that you've experienced as a result of your treatment. But by being guided by the things that really matter to you can be a really helpful steer to take you in the direction of your values. So I think with all of this, above all and underpinning all of this content is being kind to yourself. We can't pour from an empty cup. That actually it's really important to look after yourselves, that self-care is not being selfish. And by looking after ourselves, we can then support ourselves to engage in the things that matter to us and be with the people and the things that are most important to us. So in terms of additional information, if you'd like to find out any more about some of the things I've spoken about today, or think about some additional strategies that you might be able to try, there's a range of webinars that the Psychological Health Service at UH Bristol and Western have developed that are available on the hospital webpage. So just using that website link there, you can access that information. Also on that page is a range of wellbeing toolkits, so PDF documents that you can download on a range of areas that are touched on today. They're not oncology specific, but there's lots of helpful ideas there in terms of responding to difficult thoughts and feelings and things that you might be able to try in terms of helpful strategies. And then for services more widely, there's a range of services in and around the Bristol region, as well as wellbeing therapies, so NHS talking therapy services that you can contact your healthcare team and your GP for more information.